Assalamu alaikum everybody. I'm glad to be with you again in my YouTube channel after 1 year of absence. The topic we are going to discuss in our next presentations is considered to be one of the most important topics in pharmacology because it deals with drugs acting on the central nervous system. The central nervous system, as we know, is the most complex organization of matter Allah created in the universe. Everything takes place in this system. Thinking, feeling, learning, desire, movement, all functions, either under conscious or unconscious control, takes place in the central nervous system. Therefore, I would like to share with you my fascination about the central nervous system. In order to start to know the site and mechanism of action involved in the action of drugs acting on the nervous system, we have to be familiar with certain physiological facts about this system. Therefore, this lecture will be a revision of the most important physiological facts about the central nervous system. So, let us start with Bismillah. The main goals of this lecture, as I have said, is to know the structures and terminology of the central nervous system. This will include divisions of the central nervous system. We will discuss the different brain parts, especially the most important. We will discuss as well the functions of these parts. Then we'll discuss the unit structure of the central nervous system and the neuronal communication, including stimulation and inhibition of the neurons of the central nervous system. So let us start with the division of the nervous system. The nervous system, as we know, is divided mainly into two main parts, the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system, as we know, is composed of brain, which is enclosed in the bony structure of the skull, and the spinal cord, which is enclosed in the bony structure of the vertebral column. The peripheral nervous system, as we have discussed before in our previous presentation, is composed of the autonomic nervous system, both sympathetic and parasympathetic, and the somatic nervous system. Of course, as I have said, we are concerned with drugs which act on the central nervous system. Therefore, we will discuss in details the most important physiological facts about the brain. So first we'll discuss major structures and functions of the brain. We all know that the brain is composed of three main parts. The first is known as the cerebral hemispheres, and the brain contains two cerebral hemispheres, one left cerebral hemispheres and one right cerebral hemispheres. Second organ is the cerebellum. A third is known as the brainstem. Okay, so the brain is composed of three main parts that we will discuss in a few minutes. The cerebral hemispheres, there are two cerebral hemispheres, the cerebellum and the brainstem. The outer layer of the cerebral hemispheres is known as the cerebral cortex. The cerebral cortex is formed from elevated ridges, as you can see, elevated ridges. These elevated ridges, they are known as gyri, singular gyrus. Also, as we can see, there are grooves. These grooves, they are known as sulci, or singular salacus. Okay? Yet the outer layer of the cerebral hemisphere is known as cerebral cortex. This cerebral cortex is divided into 4 different loops, as we can see, by different colors. 4 different loops. The first is known as the frontal lobe. The frontal lobe is important in the intellectual functions, like thinking, like cognition, like feelings, like behavior. Thinking التفكير, cognition التعلم, feeling الشعور, behavior السلوك. As well, the frontal lobe is involved in the control of all movement, as you will see. The frontal lobe is important for the control of all movement. Therefore, the frontal lobe is very important for the survival of the human being. The other lobe is known as the parietal lobe. Parietal lobe. For parietal lobe, as we can see, we'll see in a few minutes, it is involved in sensation, all types of sensation, whether it is touch or pain or burning, whatever it is. This takes place in the parietal lobe. Also, the parietal lobe is concerned with speech, learning of languages, etc. Okay? This is the second parietal lobe. Most important, we should always remember that it is involved in sensation. A third lobe is known as the occipital lobe. Occipital lobe, usually it is involved in the color identification and also in vision. And the occipital lobe is important for vision and identification of different colors. The fourth lobe is known as temporal lobe. This is the temporal lobe. The temporal lobe is involved in hearing, and as well it shares with the frontal lobe in certain functions like storage of memory, like feelings, like learning, as you will see later. Okay? Now, the most important that we should remember that the brain is composed of 3 major parts: cerebral hemispheres, cerebellum, and brainstem. The outer layer of the cerebral hemispheres is known as cerebral cortex, and this cerebral cortex of each hemisphere, as we said, there are 2 cerebral hemispheres, one right and one left. The outer layer is the cerebral cortex, and the cerebral cortex is divided into 4 main lobes. Each has its own function. Okay? Now, we'll talk about the cerebral cortex in more details, because we have to know certain important functions. In the cerebral cortex, this is the cerebral cortex, which we said it is the outer layer of the cerebral hemispheres. This is known as the cortical area or cortical region. القشري. Cortical means the القشري الخارجية للدماغ. Okay? There is the central sulcus. This central sulcus divides the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe, as we can see. Central sulcus, groove. Central groove, known as central sulcus, divide the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. In front of this central sulcus, there is the gyrus, known as precentral gyrus. Precentral gyrus, this one, اللي هو النتوء هذا الجزء هذا النتوء هذا يسموه precentral gyrus. Precentral gyrus, there is the primary motor area. What does it mean, primary motor area? معناها all motor activity is initiated in this area. in this area. طبعا the body is presented differently, upside down and the opposite. These all we will not discuss now. المهم نعرف إن في البريسنترال gyrus there is the primary motor area. In front of this primary motor area there is some area associated with this area which controls motor activity, and it is known as premotor cortex. Premotor cortex. Okay. يبدأ في القشرة الخارجية للدماغ في central sulcus. Central sulcus, وthis central sulcus divides frontal from the parietal lobe. Okay. في frontal lobe there is the motor area. Both central gyrus, in the both central gyrus, this one blue, both central gyrus, this is known as primary somatosensory area. Primary somatosensory area. This where all sensation takes place. في الcortex هنا في الجهة هذه where all sensation will take place. طبعا as we will see later, it receives information from the different parts of the body, and the identification of the sensation takes place here in this area. يعني الواحد يحس بدماغه ما يحسش بأطرافه. يعني الإحساس كله يصير في الدماغ. هو حصل في الأطراف، مثلا وجع حصل في الأطراف، ولكن الإحساس الفعلي يحصل في الدماغ. Okay. Now the precentral area هذه in front of it there is another sensory area which is associated with this primary somatosensory area. This is known as somatosensory association area. Okay. But this is very important. We expect that any damage in the motor area will result in defect in motor activity, or any damage in the sensory area, well, the somatosensory area, will result in damage of sensation. We have to know that. Okay. Now, maybe some of you will ask how these brain areas are connected to the different body organs, to the different body. We start with the motor area. The motor area is connected to different body regions through what's known as the pyramidal and the extrapyramidal tract. The pyramidal and extrapyramidal tracts. Pyramidal tract, as you will see later, it is concerned with control of the coarse movement. All motor activity, all activity of the skeletal muscle is done through the pyramidal tract. The extrapyramidal tract is concerned with control of muscle tone of the muscle. لو كانت activity in the extrapyramidal tract is increased, this will result in muscle rigidity and vice versa. We will discuss that inshallah when we talk about Parkinsonism. Okay. Now, the motor area, it is connected to the periphery through the pyramidal tract and extrapyramidal tract. Maybe one of the most of the very long neurons are the neurons, the motor neurons, which descend, as you can see here, they descend from the motor area. This is the motor area of the cortex, of the cerebral cortex, and this is known as the upper motor neuron, and this will descend through the thalamus and down the medulla, where it will crosses to the other side of the body, and down the spinal cord to the anterior horn to the muscle. We will discuss that inshallah in details later. المهم نعرف الآن إن primary motor area is responsible for all motor activity, and it is connected to the different body organs through the pyramidal and extrapyramidal tracts. والpyramidal قلنا it controls the muscle activity, course and movement. والextrapyramidal tract controls muscle tone and fine movement. The sensory area, of course, I might have to mention that the pyramidal tract is an efferent tract. Efferent معناها they exit from the central nervous system. The sensory area, they receive information from the different parts of the body through afferent afferent input. Afferent معناها neurons, they come from the periphery towards the central nervous system. This is one example. This is an example. Of course, there are hundreds of examples. يبدأ primary sensory area, it is connected to different body organs through afferent sensory neuron. We'll discuss that later, inshallah, when we talk about analgesics, okay? يبدأ this is an example of a muscle which is connected to the sensory area through sensory input or afferent neuron, okay? Yep, this is the most important we should remember about the cerebral cortex. There is a motor area which controls motor activity, and there is a sensory area which controls sensory activity. This information we will need them later when we'll talk about different groups of drugs, inshallah. So, the second part, the cerebrum, we have said that the cerebral cortex is the outer layer of the cerebral hemispheres. هذه يسموها الcortical area. يسموها الcortical area. تحت الcortical area مباشرة underneath it there is the subcortical area. Subcortical area, okay? يبدأ عندنا cortical and subcortical. cortical هي القشرة الخارجية وسب cortical ما تحت القشرة الخارجية. الاثنين مع بعضهم الكورتيكال والسب كورتيكال ستراكشر هادو يسموهم cerebrum. يسموهم cerebrum. ده cerebrum اللي هو التيلنسيفالون. يبدأ لما نتكلم واحد يسألك what is cerebrum? Cerebrum is the cortical and subcortical structure of the cerebral hemispheres. Okay. Now subcortical cortical تكلمنا عليها جزئية متاعها وتكلمنا عن motor area و somatosensory area. Now subcortical area as well, there are very important structure that we have to know. ليش؟ لأن حنحتاجوهم في المستقبل لما نتكلموا عن different groups of drugs. subcortical area there are many structures, ولكن اللي يهمني 3 main structures اللي هو البيزل جانجليا والهايبوكامبس والolfactory bulb. These 3 major structures I have to remember, okay, so that we can understand. Basal ganglia, we need it when we will talk about Parkinsonism. The hippocampus, we need it when we talk about Alzheimer's disease and its treatment. Olfactory bulb, كذلك, we need it in the future. So what's the basal ganglia? The basal ganglia, actually, it is a complex group of neurons. As you can see, all these red spots, they are nuclei of the basal ganglia. يبدأ البيزل ganglia, they are scattered groups of neurons. They are connected together in a certain way to control certain activity. Okay, especially with the muscle activity. We'll speak about later. Okay. Now, as you can see, there are different nuclei in the basal ganglia. The most famous is the caudate nucleus. Caudate nucleus, as you can see, this is very big nucleus. Caudate ending with the amygdala. Amygdala, this is another nucleus. This is not concerned with the basal ganglia. Also, it contains other like nucleus accumbens, مهمة, nigrostriatal pathway. This is a structure of the caudate nucleus. Okay. You have the basal ganglia. This is the basal ganglia, and the basal ganglia is important to us. Why? لأن it controls muscle tone, as you will see. Through the extrapyramidal tract, it controls muscle tone. Any defect in the basal ganglia, it will lead to defect in movement, as we will see later. Okay? يبدأ الباسل ganglia قلنا there are different nuclei present in subcortical area and they control muscle tone. We'll take it in details inshallah when we talk about Parkinsonism. Now we have to be familiar with the term. Okay? Also, they said that the basal ganglia with other structures in the subcortical area, they are involved in learning, different types of learning, whether it is habitual learning or conditional learning or whatever. Okay? يبدأ what I should remember in the basal ganglia, there are several nuclei present in subcortical region of the brain above the diencephalon, as we will see, and they are responsible for control of muscle tone وكذلك and some types of learning. Second structure we should always remember is the hippocampus. Hippocampus. Well, hippocampus, as you can see, there are two of them, one on the left side of the brain and one of the right side of the brain. Why we should remember the hippocampus? Why we should remember the hippocampus? Why? لأن الهيبوكامبس is responsible for conversion of short memory to long term memory. اللي يصير اليوم يتخزن اللي هو short term memory. اليوم اللي صار اليوم it is short term. الذاكرة اليومية الحديثة هذا يتخزن إلى long term memory عن طريق الهيبوكامبس. Hippocampus. Therefore, we expect any damage in the hippocampus will result in what's known as dementia, loss of memory, dementia. وزي ما يصير في الألزهايمرز. الألزهايمرز disease, a person does not remember a recent memory. Why يحصل له loss؟ ليش؟ لأن this recent memory is not stored into long-term memory. He will not remember them. Okay, يبدأ this is the second subcortical structure we should always remember. Third, olfactory bulb. I will not talk a lot about it. It is concerned, it is olfactory bulb. It is present above in the base of the brain, above the nose, olfactory bulb. Above the nose, we expect therefore that it is involved in the sensation of smell, especially في emotion of smell. Of course, some smell will provoke happy memories, or some will provoke bad memories. All these takes place in the olfactory bulb. Okay? يبدأ this is the second structure, cerebrum. تكلمنا على cerebral cortex وتكلمنا على structures of the cerebrum اللي هو diencephalon. Okay? The third structure we are going to talk about is the diencephalon. Diencephalon. Diencephalon lies, it is subcortical area which lies immediately above the brainstem. لما قسمنا الدماغ قسمناه إلى cerebral hemispheres وcerebellum وbrainstem. The diencephalon is the lower part of the cerebral hemispheres. This one. It is formed from three important structures that many structure most ولكن I should remember this. الثالاموس, الابيثالاموس, and the hypothalamus. I should remember. As you can see, this is the thalamus, this is the epithalamus, and this is the hypothalamus. Each one of them is very important for me to discuss a site of action of drugs, inshallah, in the future. For thalamus, as we know, thalamus, all sensory or motor function which comes from the periphery, sensory which comes from the periphery, ولا motor which goes from the cortex to the periphery, it passes through the thalamus. So that's why thalamus is considered to be a relaying station. They call it a relaying station. As you will see later, inshallah, lower sensory neuron will end up in the thalamus, while upper sensory neuron will start from the thalamus to the sensory area. فالمهم اللي نعرفه الآن إن الثالاموس is a relaying station for all incoming sensory or outcoming motor activity from the cerebral cortex. Okay? Second, about the thalamus, as we can see in a few minutes, it is involved as well in consciousness, with sleep and alertness through the reticular activating system. We will talk about them in a few minutes. Okay? Yet the thalamus is important for certain function as a relay station, كان any damage في الثالاموس معناها all sensory input to the cortex will not be there، وهذه مشكلة. وكذلك it is involved in the maintaining of consciousness as we'll see. Epithalamus, I should always remember that it is the pineal gland. The pineal gland, which is present in the lower subcortical area above the brainstem, pineal gland secretes melatonin. وكلنا نعرف الميلاتونين هذا regulates what's known as biological clock, day-night cycle, biological clock. فالناس يقول لك اللي هم they are deficient for melatonin يتلخبط عندهم النوم متاعهم، لأن melatonin it is the biological regulator of sleep and emotion. Okay, يبدأ هذا الابيثالاموس. The most important organ, I should never forget it, الhypothalamus. This is very important organ. Why? لأن الhypothalamus controls many of the endocrine function of the body, as you will see. الهايبوثالاموس مقسمة إلى 3 أقسام رئيسية، مقسمة إلى 3 أجزاء. الجزء اللوطي لهذا التحتاني هذا يسموه anterior region of the hypothalamus, anterior region of the hypothalamus. وهذه very important as we can see زي ما بنشوف هنا it is connected to the pituitary gland اللي يسموها master endocrine gland. This is known as master endocrine gland. This controls all the endocrine function of the body as you will see later. Very small. هذه حبة الحمص هذه تتحكم في كل الغدد الصماء اللي في الجسم. This pituitary gland is connected to the hypothalamus as you will see in a few minutes. Okay. يبدأ الانتيريور region اللي هو of the hypothalamus controls the pituitary gland to the secretion of many hormones like corticotropin releasing hormone, like thyrotropin releasing hormone, like growth hormone releasing hormone, and oxytocin and vasopressin. All these hormones, they control activity of the pituitary gland. Of course, oxytocin and vasopressin, they are connected and secreted through the posterior pituitary gland into the general circulation. We'll discuss that inshallah when we talk about the endocrine system. يبدأ the anterior region of the hypothalamus is very important because it secretes a lot of glands which controls the pituitary gland activity. The middle region of the hypothalamus, usually middle region, this part, middle region, it controls the appetite. There is the satiety center معروفة الساتايتي مراكز الإشباع موجودة في الهايبوثالاموس. فلو لما لو satiety centers they are not there, people will feel always hungry. ولكن satiety center will say stop, I have my enough. يبدأ الكنترول appetite through satiety center. وكذلك growth هرمون يحصل له synthesis in this area. growth هرمون زي ما نعرف الهرمون اللي هو responsible for growth of different body tissue يحصل له synthesis in the middle region of the hypothalamus. last اللي هو posterior region of the hypothalamus هذه موجودة فيها temperature regulating centers. temperature regulating centers ومن اسمها معناها temperature regulating centers معناها centers اللي تتحكم في درجة حرارة الجسم. temperature regulating center فمعناها any defect يحصل في this area. طبعا this is done through the autonomic nervous system. لو مثلا واحد شعر بالحر على طول يحصل vasodilation، ولو حصل شعر بالبرد على طول يحصل vasoconstriction ويحصل shivering والsweating will be blocked. okay. يبدأ temperature regulating center موجودة في posterior region. okay. يبدأ الhypothalamus very important. we should never forget الhypothalamus لأن it controls endocrine function وكذلك it controls body temperature and the appetite. As we can see the hypothalamus inshallah we'll discuss it later. This is the hypothalamus. It is connected to the pituitary gland through neuronal connection and through blood supply connection. I will not go into details on that لأن حنتكلم عليها إن شاء الله لما نتكلموا على الانdocrine system, drugs acting on the endocrine system. لو ربي أعطانا عمر ويدعونا بطول العمر إن شاء الله والصحة والعافية. فإن شاء الله حنتكلم على هذا إن how الhypothalamus controls all endocrine function. As you can see, كل endocrine organs they are under the control of the hypothalamus. Okay. Now this is the diencephalon, as I have told you. Diencephalon, which is formed from the thalamus or from the epithalamus and the hypothalamus. So we talked about the cortical area, subcortical area, and the and the diencephalon. Now we'll talk about another subcortical region which lies in the diencephalon region, known as the limbic system. The limbic system. The limbic system. Limbic system, like البيزك, we should always remember it. ليش؟ لأن as we can see, it has very important functions. The limbic system, as we can see, it is formed from different nuclei, as you can see. It contains formed from the hypothalamus, which we already talked about. It is formed from the hippocampus, olfactory bulb, which we talked about, from the cingulate gyrus, septum, the amygdala nucleus, and from the mammillary body. المهم اللي نعرف أن limbic system, it is composed from different structures, subcortical structures, where with this limbic system they said that they are important in regulation of behavior. في السلوك. كل السلوك is regulation done through the limbic system. شنو هو البيهيفير السلوك؟ like المود، المزاج، الإيموشن، الانفعالات، وكذلك response of body to stress. طبعا response of body to stress is done through the hypothalamus. الhypothalamus, as I said, it controls an endocrine function, and the hypothalamus, when the body is exposed to stress, whatever it is, the hypothalamus will be activated, and the hypothalamus will release, and when the body is exposed to stress, the hypothalamus will release the corticotropin releasing hormone, or corticotropin releasing hormone will act on the pituitary gland to release ACTH, والACTH will act on the adrenal cortex to release cortisone. فالكورتيزون يرتفع، معروف الكورتيزون وتأثيرات الضارة. المهم اللي نعرفه أن limbic system is composed of different structures, including the hypothalamus, the hippocampus, olfactory bulb, amygdala, and mammillary body, and they are involved in the regulation of behavior. Also, limbic system, it is involved in learning and cognition, تعلم, especially by smell through the olfactory bulb. Okay. وكذلك التخزين المعلومة عن طريق الهايبوكامبس اللي هو conversion of the short-term memory of smell into long-term memories. طبعا it is involved in memories as well. Okay. Through الهايبوكامبس. Okay, يبدأ this is the limbic system. We should always remember, if there is a disturbance in the limbic system, we expect that the body behavior of the person will be changed. Okay. Now this all about the cerebral hemispheres. The cerebral hemispheres. And next will be the brainstem. Brainstem. Second, brainstem. As we said, the brain is composed from three major parts. Cerebral hemispheres, we talked about them, and the brainstem and the cerebellum. So the brainstem lies just below the diencephalon. This is the diencephalon, which we just talked about it. This is the diencephalon. This is the brainstem. This is the brainstem enlarged. If the brainstem is composed from three main parts, or anatomically, it is divided into three main parts: midbrain, the bones, and the medulla. Midbrain, pons, and medulla. And most important, I should always remember, is the medulla, as we will see later. Now, the first part, the midbrain, as we will see, this part is associated with alertness, with arousal, through the reticular activating system, as we will see later. The pons, it acts as a relay station between the messages which comes from the cortex and goes to the cerebrum. As we will see later, inshallah, the cerebrum is concerned with the fine control of movement, okay, posture and etc. This is done through the motor area. The motor area sends its information to the cerebellum through the bones. فالبونز هنا يشتغل كريلي ستيشن والريلي message between the cortex اللي هو cerebral cortex, the motor area, and the cerebellum. This is very important function. As well, the bones is the origin of many cranial nerves. The origin of many cranial nerves, like trigeminal nerve, like the facial nerve, etc. Okay. A third most important part I should always remember is the medulla oblongata. Medulla oblongata. طبعا medulla oblongata is the lower part of the brain which connects the brain to the spinal cord. Medulla oblongata, this is the spinal cord, beginning of the spinal cord. Medulla oblongata connects the brain to the spinal cord. This is one. Medulla oblongata, I should always remember, it controls the vital function, what is known as vital functions, like the functions of the cardiovascular system. Many of the functions of cardiovascular system, they are done in the medulla. Like, for example, the vasomotor center, which we talked about it when we talked about the autonomic nervous system. The vasomotor center, they are centers which control the diameter of the blood vessel. Okay, vasomotor center through sympathetic or parasympathetic nervous system, of course. For this will regulate. Also, there is the cardiac centers, cardiac acceleration centers or cardiac inhibitory centers موجودة في المظلة. كذلك respiratory centers, they are present in the medulla. All these are vital centers which life depends on them. فبعض الناس يقول لك صار له مثلا موت دماغي ولكن قاعد عايش. ليش؟ لأن المظلة not death yet. فالريسبيريشن ماشي والكارديوفاسكولار سيستم ماشي ولكن there is no consciousness، فقد وعي. اوكي، فمهمة دمج اني مدن لو وينهبت المظلة معناها cardiovascular function will be inhibited respiratory centers will be inhibited. اوكي، يبدأ هذا very very important لما نتكلموا على general anesthetic. اوكي، يبدأ this is the brainstem. عشان نذكر في البرينستم most important ان نذكره ان المظلة contains vital centers necessary for life. اوكي، هذا second part. يبدأ تكلمنا على الفيرست part cerebral hemispheres. السكند part اللي هو brainstem. System we are going to talk about is known as the reticular activating system. Reticular activating system. ومن اسمها reticular معناها it is a network وactivating معناها ينشط والactivate البرين. How this is done? What is the reticular activating system? Reticular activating system, it is a network of neurons, group of neurons that pass up the brainstem to the diencephalon اللي اتكلم عنه diencephalon يقاني. Okay, and then from the diencephalon to the cortex, to the higher cortical area. Okay, this system receives sensory information either from the periphery in a form of touch ولا pain for example ولا temperature, and this sensory will pass through the reticular activating system. Also it receives auditory stimulation from the ears. auditory معناها سمعي. It receives stimulation from the ears, وكذلك it receives stimulation from the eye, visual stimulation. All this stimulation will go up to the cortex. So what's the function of the reticular activating system? شو الفانكشن بتاعها؟ Our function is to maintain alertness ولا wakefulness، إن الإنسان يقعد صاحي واعي، صاحي واعي. يعني you expect إن واحد لما يخش في هدوء ولا بيرقد مثلا، فالاكتيفيتي من الاي خلاص في الظلام، ما عادش في اكتيفيتي جايه من الاي الا بسيطه. مع من الايرز نفس الشيء، ما فيش ضوضاء، ما فيش وجع، ما فيش حراره، كل الاكتيفيتي هنا ما فيش نشاط ماشي للكورتكس، فالواحد حيخلد للنوم مثلا. ولكن لو في ضوضاء مثلا، ولو في ضي ساطع مثلا، ولا في وجع، معناها في اكتيفيتي راح cerebral cortex، فالراجل ما يقدرش ينام. person cannot sleep. Correct? Okay? Now, يبقى this is the most important. The reticular activating system, the main function is to keep the person alert and awake. طبعا if we depress these, the person will go into sleep and maybe unconsciousness. فقدان الوعي زي ما يقولوا بعدين. Okay? For some drugs, as you will see later, they cause inhibition of the reticular activating system. The person will become less alert, less aware, and he might lose consciousness. Okay? This is the first function. The second function, which is important as well, this reticular activating system will act as a filtration system. filtration شو معناه؟ معناه حيجي كثير من المعلومات، ولكن only the most important information can pass to the central nervous system, to the higher cortical area. مش كل شيء يمر إلى ال higher cortical area، لأن الديسيجن زي ما قلنا القرار حيتخذ وين؟ ياخذ في ال higher cortical area. فلو المعلومات جت كثيرة وغير منظمة وغير مفلترة، معناها بصير لخبطة. ولكن الفلتريشن، الفلترة وين تصير في at the brainstem level هنا. فالمعلومة المهمة بس اللي البادي needs can pass the reticular activating system to the higher cortical area. Okay? So this is the second part of the brain, which is the brainstem and its associated reticular activating system. يبدأ reticular activating systems زي ما قلنا they are network of neuron that pass up the brainstem to the diencephalon up to the cortex. قلنا it receives information from the peripheral afferent sensory input, either visual, auditory, touch, pain, temperature, etc. Its main function is to filter out information from external sources and focus on one particular fact and maintenance arousal and alertness. Okay? Yeah, this is the reticular activating system, and by this we finish talking about the most important facts about the brainstem. A third part of the brain is the cerebellum. The cerebellum. The cerebellum, I will not talk much about it. زي ما قلنا, this is the cerebellum, the third part. It is concerned with motor movement, the cerebellum, and coordination. وكذلك في motor learning, في sense of the body, position, to know البوزيشن تاعك في البوستشر تاعك وين، هل انت up or down, sense of body position. Balance and equilibrium takes place in the cerebellum. Fine movement, coordination, كل coordination of fine movement takes place in the cerebellum. We expect that any defect in the cerebellum will بيحصل عند the motor defect. Okay? يبقى this is the third part اللي هو cerebellum. Some drugs like alcohol, for example, produces ataxia. Why it produces ataxia? لأنها تنهبت cerebellum activity، فبالتالي الموtor coordination of movement will be lost. Okay? يبدأ this is very briefly البرين. Very briefly البرين. The second part of our presentation will be about the cell types of the central nervous system. Actually, there are two types of cells in the nervous system. One is known as the glial cell, and the other are the neurons. Okay, neurons or nerve cells. We have nerve cells and glial cells. If we talk about the neuron or the nerve cell, usually most of the neurons, they look the same. Usually it is formed from nerve cells or the neuron. It is formed from cell body. This cell body usually contains the nucleus of the neuron, and there are branches known as dendrites. These dendrites, they are the site of interaction with another neuron, as you will see later. Okay, dendrites. One of these dendrites is large enough to form what's known as an axon. This axon usually terminates in a nerve terminal. When nerve terminals, as we'll see later, they are the site of storage of a neurotransmitter. These usually nerve terminals, they synapse with another either cell body or neuron or whatever, or another dendrites, and a form of synapse. This is the synapses. Synapse is the space between a nerve terminal and another dendrites or another nerve terminal. Okay? This is the nerve cell. Ependymal cells. This is a glial cells. As I have said, there are three different types of glial cells. This is a glial cell. Usually, this is the essentials for the formation of the epithelial cells. This will lead to formation of epithelial cells, which covers the cavity, ventricular cavity of the brains, ventricles. It will cover the cavity of the brain. It protects the brain from any insult. Okay. A second type of glial cell is known as oligodendrocyte. Well, oligodendrocyte, this is responsible for formation of the myelin sheath. Well, myelin sheath is very important because the myelin sheath will make the conduction through the axon faster, as you will see inshallah later when we talk about local anesthetic. The myelin sheath is produced by oligodendrocyte. Okay. A third type of cells in the nervous system is known as astrocytes. It is also a glial cell. The central nervous system. It is either types of cells in the central nervous system. They are either nerve cell or a glial cell. A glial cell might be one of the three. Astrocytes is one of them. The astrocytes is very important because it is concerned with the metabolism which takes place in the neurons or in the central nervous system in general. Also, it regulates the blood flow through the central nervous system. And most recently, they said that the astrocytes as well, they have their own communication. They act as neurons. They communicate information from one side to another of the central nervous system. Right? So these are the type of cells present in the nervous system. They are either nerve cells or glial cells. And each has its own function. So what are the types of nerve cells? Neuron. What are the types of neuron in the central nervous system. Actually, there are three different types, depends on the function. The first type is known as sensory neuron. And as you can see, sensory neuron, there is cell body. From the cell body branches the axon, one right, one left axon, and each will end up with nerve terminal. Usually, sensory neuron will receive information from one of the dendrites, and this information will be transmitted to the next dendrites at the end of the cell body. This is the sensory neuron. Sensory neuron usually a cell body contains two dendrites which branches to form axon. The other type is known as relay neuron. Usually a relay neuron is between a sensory neuron and the motor neuron. Sensory neuron and motor is a more relay neuron. For relay neuron, as you can see, there is a cell body with dendrites. There is an axon, but there is no myelin sheath over the axon. There is no myelin sheath. Usually the axon is short, it's not long as it is in sensory neuron or motor neuron. This is the motor neuron, typical motor neuron, which is formed of cell body with dendrites. One of them will form the axon, and the axon usually terminates in nerve terminal. So these are the different types of which of the neurons which we will see when we talk about drugs acting on the central nervous system. Last thing, I will not explain details because I have done already in a previous presentation that I will give you the address. The cell communication, how cells are communicated together in the central nervous system. As we said that a neuron is communicated with another neuron through a synapse. Usually activity from one neuron is transmitted to the other neuron through the synapse. What happens in the synapse if we enlarge this area? The synapse, if we enlarge it, we find that the synapse is formed from a nerve ending of the first neuron. This is the nerve ending of the first neuron, and the dendrites or the cell body of the other neuron, of the receiving neuron. Okay? You have the nerve terminal of the first neuron. Usually there is a neurotransmitter, a chemical messenger known as neurotransmitter. This neurotransmitter, it is sensitized or stored in a special storage vesicle in the nerve terminal. When excitation is arrived at the nerve terminal, it will lead to opening of calcium channel. Calcium will rush in, causing exocytosis, a process known as exocytosis, which is release of the neurotransmitter. This is the neurotransmitter molecules. Once these neurotransmitter molecules they are released, they either act on postsynaptic receptors or presynaptic receptors. Okay, you have the neurotransmitter. After it is released, it will act either on presynaptic receptor, which are known as autoreceptors present on the nerve terminal. We talked about that in previous presentation. Or they act on postsynaptic receptors, postsynaptic on the other neuron. As we have said before, there are three different types of receptor. There are receptors which are linked to ion channels. There are receptors which are linked to G protein. There are receptors which are linked to enzyme-linked receptor. In details, you will find it in this presentation, which the link of which I will give in comments. You have the details of this, how this happens. how the activation takes place through the activation of the ion channels or G protein or enzyme, and what will be the net result. Okay? Usually for central nervous system, most of them, they are linked to ion channels. They are linked to ion channel. Therefore, once the neurotransmitter is released, it will open certain ion channel. وزي ما عرفنا الions they are either positively charged or negatively charged. فلو مثلا neurotransmitter will open positively charged ion channel like a sodium, in this case بيحصل depolarization or excitation, and this is known as excitatory postsynaptic potential. Excitatory postsynaptic potential. An excitatory postsynaptic potential neurotransmitter will open sodium channel, and sodium channel will cause excitation or depolarization of postsynaptic membrane. Details of this I have covered before in this presentation. Please refer to it instead of repeating the same information again. This is very interesting lecture, and it will talk about the basics of neurotransmission. Okay? Opposite, if the ion channels are negatively charged ions like chloride will enter the cell, producing hyperpolarization of the postsynaptic membrane, and this hyperpolarization will result in inhibitory postsynaptic potential. This is how communication takes place in the central nervous system. I will recommend you to go back to this lecture in order to know the details of this communication. It is a very important lecture. Okay? So, by this I have finished talking about the most important terminology and physiological background that we need in our next presentations. Okay? So in summary, we talked about structure and function of the brain, including the brain parts. We talked about cerebral cortex, how it is divided into 4 loops, what's the primary motor area, and what's the primary sensory area. We talked about the cerebrum, how it is formed from the cortical and subcortical structure, and we talked about subcortical area like the basal ganglia, like the hippocampus, like olfactory bulb. We talked about the diencephalon, how it is divided into thalamus, epithalamus, and hypothalamus, and what are the importance of each of them. We talked about brainstem, in midbrain, in pons, and medulla, and we talked about the reticular activating system and the limbic system, and it's involved in behavior. Okay? We talked as well about types of cell in the central nervous system, whether they are neuron or glial cells, and what are the different types of glial cells. We talked about how they are communicated. Our next lecture will be about non-specific C.N.S. depressants, and this will include the general anesthetics. So I hope to see you in my next presentation. I will say لله الحمد من قبل ومن بعد.
شكرا لكم على حسن الاستماع. الرجاء لا تنسوا الاشتراك في القناة، الإعجاب، التعليق والمشاركة مع الزملاء. دمتم بخير وعافية، والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله.